And there it is. Okay, we're live. Charles Moscowitz here. Thanks for joining me, everyone. Welcome to the program. And my special guest this segment is Stephen G. Meyer. He received his PhD from the University of Cambridge in the philosophy of science after having worked as an oil industry geophysicist. And get rid of that. And now he directs the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington. And he is the author of the new book, Return of the God Hypothesis. Stephen, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on, Charles.
So basically, your book is both a look at the science of intelligent design, but it's also somewhat of a history of the philosophy, particularly in the Western culture, of the diminution of the God hypothesis, starting with the maybe shortly after the Renaissance, and then into some of the Enlightenment figures like Isaac Newton and others. So could you give us, before we get into the basic questions, a quick synopsis of how that happened, how God was taken out of the central understanding of Western life, and by whom, and how did they do it?
Yeah, right. The title of the book actually invites a story, that story in particular. It begins with the discussion of the period of time called the Scientific Revolution, which historians state differently, but I think stretches back into the 1300s and probably ends around 1750. The heyday of this period is between 1500 and 1750, and this is a period of in which modern science developed systematic methods of studying nature. And when historians look at this period of time, you have figures like Newton and Boyle and Kepler. Newton is misportrayed by many historians as a mechanist or perhaps a deist at best. In fact, he has a profoundly biblical theology of nature and makes profound design arguments in his own scientific works, in the optics in particular, and also in the General Scholium, a theological epilogue that he writes to the Principia, perhaps the greatest work, certainly one of the greatest works of physics ever written. So this period of time is characterized by deeply religious figures who are investigating nature for very specifically religious reasons. There's a wonderful historian of science, Rodney Stark, who worked at, he was a professor at University of Washington for years and then at Baylor, book titled For the Glory of God, about this period of time, documenting the theological motivation that these early scientists had in studying nature. They believed that it revealed the mind of the creator, both in the mathematical harmony and regularity of nature that they dubbed the laws of nature, implying that there was a lawgiver, a divine lawgiver, and also in the exquisite design of individual or specific systems in nature. Newton was fascinated with the eye, for example, and showed that its intricacy not only suggested design, but also the way in which the eye's design anticipated the properties of light was additional evidence of same. So this was a deeply religious project, and it reflected Judeo-Christian ideas from late medieval Catholic theology and from the Reformation, and also from the Hebrew Bible. But during the latter part of the 18th century, you had figures like Hume and Kant, Enlightenment philosophers, and Kant was still vaguely theistic. Hume definitely not. But during the 19th century, there was a series of scientific ideas about the origins of the solar system, the planet Earth, and then finally the origin of new species, and with Darwin and the origin of life itself. And by the end of the 19th century, scientists believe it was possible to paint a kind of seamless story or narrative of where everything had come from without any reference to a designing intelligence of the sort that Newton had invoked, or Boyle had invoked, or Kepler. Kepler was a wonderful figure who said that the job of the scientist was to think God's thoughts after him. Wow. And so there was a shift in philosophy in the 18th century that percolated into science in the 19th. And during the 20th century, we inherited a default worldview known as scientific materialism, an atheistic worldview that claimed science as its basis, and that has had a huge impact on our 20th century life, both in science but in the wider culture, as many, even the totalitarian regimes, have claimed scientific basis and for their materialistic ideologies. So that's where we were. I'm arguing in the new book that that's beginning to shift, and it's beginning to shift for scientific reasons, that the three great discoveries have been made that challenge scientific materialism, and more scientists are opening their minds to the reality, first, of intelligent design of some kind. But in the new book, I go further than arguing for a designer of some unspecified kind. I address the question, who is the designer, and what can scientists tell us about that agent?
Right. I mean, you actually arrive at, over a process of your own intellectual and maybe spiritual development, the idea that there is a personal God. And I think that when I hear you talk about some of the Enlightenment thinkers, but probably before Kant, or maybe even up to, like Newton and Kepler, I mean, it reminds me of some of the thought of Thomas Jefferson when he made reference to nature and nature's God. And when he made reference to that we're endowed by the Creator, with rights. I mean, it was in a sense an echo of the Hebrew Bible, which said that God created men and women in his image, and that every life as such was unique. And this is an idea that was echoed right up until that time, and that the idea of studying science was not seen as separate from or in any way divorced from study of faith and of God. It was seen as a parallel, separate but parallel thing. It's like studies of apples and oranges. One thing doesn't negate the other. They both exist. You study the supernatural, which is mostly unknown but yet revealed in Western culture, and the natural, which is the creation of that unknown and unrevealed creator.
Well, right.
And,
There's two. Sorry to interrupt, but
please.
yeah, well, there's two great views going back all the way to the ancient Greeks. One is that matter is the thing from which everything else comes, matter and energy, and perhaps pre-existing space and time. And the other is that matter and energy, and perhaps even space and time, are contingent or created entities that arose from a transcendent mind. It's the materialist view or the idealist / theistic view. Another way to frame that same question is to say, does nature have within it the principles that explain its origin and its reality, or does nature in some way point to something beyond itself? And the discoveries that I'm highlighting in the new book suggest that nature points to something beyond itself, or another way to put that is that something beyond nature is necessary to explain what we see in nature. Richard Dawkins, the famed New Atheist writer and Oxford professor, and has written books like The God Delusion to advance the idea that science properly understood undermines or renders implausible belief in God, has made a very provocative statement, which I take head on in the book. And the statement is, the universe we observe has exactly the properties we should expect. If at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And I argue in the book first that statement implies that the big systems of thought, the metaphysical systems of thought or worldviews, are testable. You can evaluate them by looking at the world around us to see if the properties that the universe has actually match what you'd expect given a particular worldview. Dawkins says that he thinks that the properties that you would expect on blind, pitiless indifference, which is just a shorthand way of talking about materialism, are exactly what you would expect. But I contest that and argue that there are three great discoveries that show that the universe is not self-organizing and self-existent, but rather it requires an external input of information from a transcendent and mind who is also active in the creation.
Right. And I want to bear down on that a little bit, because, you mentioned that some of the Enlightenment figures had a fascination with the eye of a bee. And bringing that up to Darwin in his diary said that the sight of the peacock feather made him sick, and he spent much of the rest of his life as quite ill. And the reason it made him sick was because the incredible intricacy of that one feather, with its multifaceted colors, all perfectly geometrically designed and shaped, it's not the kind of thing that can just happen by accident. It doesn't just sort of emerge, like he also said in his diary, like all of life in a warm little pond. There was something that had to have happened. And when you talk about the eye of the bee as perhaps a proof of a greater existence of the supernatural elements in creation, scientists can explain in great and very important detail all the mechanisms of sight and how that works and all of the things that have to happen to make that work. But they can't explain the moment when something that is not seeing sees.
Well, it's a very good analogy. We
Yeah.
understand the intricacies of internal combustion engines, and we can give a completely physical account of how locomotion is produced from ignition forward. But we can't. But giving a physical account of combustion in the chambers and so forth does not explain the origin of the engine apart from the ingenuity of the engineers.
Right.
And so, but this idea that or the perception of design in living organisms is something that's perennial. It goes way back. If you think of the coiled nautilus or the intricate interdependent parts of organ systems like the eye, biologists from time immemorial and right to the present have acknowledged that life gives the appearance of design. The innovation in thinking that came with Darwin was the claim that that appearance of design is an illusion. It's merely apparent because there's an unguided, undirected process, namely natural selection acting on random variations, and we would now say mutations, that produces that appearance. But the question is, does that mutation selection mechanism explain all appearances of design? It certainly can account for small scale variations, peppered moths varying in their coloration, or the Galapagos finches getting a little longer or shorter beaks. But does it explain the origin of birds, or the origin of animals or mammals? The major innovations in the history of life, and increasingly evolutionary biologists are doubting that. It certainly doesn't explain the origin of the first life. You cited his warm little pond quotation. Darwin never attempted to explain the origin of life. He had one very short letter to a man named Joseph Hooker where he speculated on that. That's the warm little pond quote.
Yeah.
But the problem of the origin of life and the problem of biological innovation has been made very much more acute in recent years in biology by the discovery since Watson and Crick and right up to the present of the primacy of the importance of information in living systems. If you want to give your computer a new function, you've got to provide code. And the same thing turns out to be true of the biological world. If you want to build a cell in the first place, you've got to have a lot of information that has to be produced somehow. Right. And undirected chemical processes have proven insufficient to account for the code, getting from chemistry to code, very difficult problem in origin of life research. And if you want to explain the origin of the new code, you need to build a new form of life, even if you presuppose a starting point, a simple cell. That's difficult too, because mutations, we know, degrade information, right. And they can sometimes modify proteins very slightly and give them either slightly different functions, but they don't change the overall structure of proteins, nor the large scale body plans that are necessary to account for fundamentally new forms of life. So this problem of the origin of information is hugely problematic in evolutionary biology. And it's the reason that both chemical evolutionary theory and biological evolutionary theory are running into serious problems. Most scientists now just simply acknowledge we have no chemical evolutionary explanation for the origin of life. And increasingly, even evolutionary biologists are acknowledging that the longstanding mutation selection mechanism of neo-Darwinism lacks the creative power to produce innovations rather than small-scale modifications in the history of life.
Right. Plus, my understanding is that mutations generally are, they're lurking parables. I mean, well, they're outside of the medium of any existing species, and as such, they're less likely to reproduce. That they're outtakes. But this gets into one of the basic assumptions of the evolutionists, which is a confusion between evolution and adaptation. That different species, including in a way humanity, we adapt to different environments over time. but that doesn't mean that we've evolved. I mean, for example, some people have darker skin tone, more melanin than others, because for umpteen how many millennia, they are living nearer to the equator and they need to protect themselves from a more direct sunlight. Whereas if you live nearer to the Arctic Circle, you need more sunlight because there's less sunlight. So you have lighter, less melanin in your skin. It's something that's an adaptation to the environment. There's a lot of complex factors involved, but it's not.
Well, one of the really important complex factors is a store of latent genetic information that allows organisms to respond to environmental changes but within the limits of the adaptive capacity that's programmed into them. We have pre-programmed adaptive capacity. The real question is the origin of the programming. Where did that come from? This is the question that's become acute since a period of time in the 1950s and 60s, known now retrospectively as the molecular biological revolution. It starts with Watson and Crick, 1953. They elucidate the structure of the DNA molecule. Then in 1957 and 58, Crick advances something called the sequence hypothesis, which is the idea that along the spine of the DNA molecule, along the interior of that twisting double helix that we all know from high school biology, there are chemical subunits that are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text, or perhaps we would say the zeros and ones in a section of software. And in fact, Bill Gates, the software developer here in Redmond, where I am, has said that DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. Richard Dawkins acknowledges that the DNA contains machine code. And we know from experience that programs come from programmers, that code comes from coders. In fact, whenever we find information, especially in an alphabetic or a digital form, and we trace it back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process, whether we're talking about computer programs or written text or information in a radio signal, such as or whatever signal it is that's transmitting our voices.
All of these things, like
information is the province of mind. It's a product of mind. And so the discovery of information at the foundation of life is a powerful indicator of the activity of a designing mind and the origin of life. And I've argued which is what I argued in my book Signature in the Cell. But in my second book, Darwin's Doubt, I showed that it's also an indicator of mind in the history of life. These big explosions of biological form that we see abruptly coming into the fossil record in events like the Cambrian explosion or the mammalian radiation require vast amounts of novel genetic information. And the kind of information that genes contain is the kind that we know from experience only arises from intelligent agents, from minds. So I think you have a powerful indication of design in the origin and history of life.
Oh, I think that, as Jefferson might have said, it's self-evident. It's obvious in front of anybody who has a mind that these things are not accidental. And as far as computer code goes, that's a creation of the human mind. As you say, that is something that is put into an inanimate object and programmed, and it's a reflection of human knowledge. It's not a creation in and of itself. And also, as
chemistry doesn't spontaneously move in a life-friendly direction, and it certainly doesn't move in a direction that would produce DNA with sequence-specific chemical subunits that are functioning like alphabetic text in accord with an independent symbol convention within the context of a larger information storage, transmission, and processing system. That's what we're finding inside cells. It's mind-boggling. It dwarfs our own high-tech digital technology, but it is digital technology. It's extraordinary.
Right. And it's ultimately the sum total of human intellectual and spiritual, I would add, knowledge over time that has.
Well, our code is, but we weren't around to generate the origin of life. So it seems to point to another mind that transcends our own. Yes, sure.
It gets into the issue of creation. Now, some of the Eastern religions, but I would say more the atheists and the New Age type religions, they hypothesize that there was no creation. Everything has always existed forever and will exist forever. I think that science seriously throws that theory out. Things like erosion, for example. I mean, there are all sorts of factors we could look at in earth science that would disprove that. But putting that aside, the Western conception is that there was a moment in which a creator created creation and did so by out of the mind of the creator. It was like a supernatural event, not a natural event. So when you have atheists tell me, well, I want to see evidence of God, I want to see it in show me proof. You can't show it in proof because we're talking about the natural world, whereas the creator of the universe is supernatural. We're talking about apples and oranges again. So
Well, there is evidence, but it's evident. There is powerful evidence when coupled with standard forms of scientific and philosophical reasoning. And what I do in the book is to show that there are three great pieces of evidence that point to the reality of a transcendent and active intelligence,
okay.
also known as God, um, and that we can use very established methods of reasoning from that evidence to establish the reality of the creator, not in the mode of a mathematical proof, but in the mode of a well-supported scientific or philosophical hypothesis. Only in mathematics do you get proof with 100% certainty, and only if you presuppose certain self-evident axioms. Using a method of reasoning known in the sciences as inference to the best explanation, or the method of multiple competing hypotheses, I posit first the existence of a designing intelligence to account, for example, the digital information and the information processing system that we're finding in even the very simplest cells. Again, we know from our uniform and repeated experience, the basis of all scientific reasoning, that functional digital information arises from an intelligent source. One information scientist who first applied information theory to molecular biology said that the creation of information is habitually associated with conscious activity. So the discovery of information at the foundation of life provides very strong grounds for inferring prior conscious activity. Okay. But then that's the argument of my first two books. Then I had people say, well, who do you think the designing intelligence is? You don't specify. And so to address that question, I broadened the scope of the investigation to look not only at the evidence in biology, but also to look at the evidence in physics of something called the fine-tuning of the basic physical parameters of the universe, and also the evidence that has been revealed from astronomy, astrophysics, and cosmology, suggesting that the universe indeed had a beginning. And there, what you were saying a minute ago is so apropos, because the two great systems of thought in the West, materialism on the one hand, and theism on the other, have had very conflicting expectations about what we should find as far as evidence of the origin of the universe. Materialists have long believed that the universe, that the matter and energy are the prime realities, the things from which everything else comes, the ontological ground of all being, if you're speaking philosophically. Theists have said, no, the universe is a contingent entity that was created by an external being of great power and intellect, and therefore have expected that the universe would have a beginning. And in fact, that's the first words of the Genesis account, in the beginning. The great discovery of modern cosmology is that, as best we can tell, the universe did in fact have a beginning. It's expanding outward from a point of essentially creation. And we have multiple indicators from both observational astronomy and theoretical physics suggesting that the universe did have a starting point. And therefore, the expectation of theism is confirmed by our observations of the properties of the universe, whereas our expectation based on materialism is not. Therefore, the observations confer greater support on a theistic hypothesis. That's a kind of, in philosophy or epistemology, that's sometimes called Bayesian probability calculus or Bayesian form of reasoning. But using that, I think you can make a very strong case for the existence and reality of God.
Right. It's also the first words of the Gospel of John, where he synthesizes creation and the Greek concept of logos, which is a definition of reason, by saying if the first there was the Word, and the Word was God, and God was
in the beginning was the Word. And this turns out to be a powerfully relevant scientific observation, because what we're finding in biology is that it's information that's primary. In the 19th century, people thought, the scientists thought that we could describe all of reality in terms of matter and energy and space and time. We now know there's an additional and crucial element, and that's information. The information is what configures or arranges the matter into systems like cells and animals and human beings. So the origin of information is crucial to understanding the origin of life. And it turns out, and this is one of the arguments in my book, and one of the new arguments, is that it turns out that in cosmology, there's also an information problem. To model the origin of the universe mathematically, the physicists who do this, sometimes called quantum cosmologists, have had to input information into their mathematical apparatus. They have to constrain the degrees of mathematical freedom so that their models produce a universe like ours. Our universe has specificity. It's not just any old universe. It has certain types of structures. And so information turns out to be critical, not only for the origin of life, but also for the origin of the universe. And actually, this idea of information at the foundation of the universe is also confirmed by the discovery of what's called the fine-tuning, that the laws of physics have very particular mathematical structure, the forces have very particular strengths, the elementary particles have very particular weights, and everything is the physicists describe fine-tuned as these different parameters fall within very narrow limits or tolerances in order to allow for there to be a life-permitting or life-conducive universe. And there doesn't seem to be any underlying physical reason or logical reason why these values have to be set the way they were. And yet they could have been a whole range of other values. And the values they have is incredibly improbable against natural ranges. And therefore, many physicists have concluded that the fine-tuning evidence suggests a fine-tuner. We live in a kind of Goldilocks universe where everything is just right. And the best explanation seems to be it's just right because it was intended to be.
There's a certain system, a natural system of checks and balances, if you will. And you mentioned mathematics. I think that mathematics provides, and this goes back to the earliest of times, a principle that does prove that there was a creator, and that's the principle of zero. Because if you have zero, the symbol zero means nothing. And the symbol one or a fraction of one or anything above that means something. Even negative one means something in inverse, but it's still something. So 0 plus 0 is 0. 0 minus 0 is 0. So how can you create something out of nothing? This is a mathematical idea. The only way to create something out of nothing, it doesn't happen in nature. There's only one way to do it, and that's through God. It can only have to have been some kind of a supernatural event, whether it happened with the Big Bang or however it happened. Something at some point was created out of nothing. And for something to come out of nothing, that's not scientifically possible. Therefore, there had to have been something bigger than science to make that happen so we can understand science. And I think once we accept that concept, we then realize that the thing that differentiates men and women from all other living beings is our ability to perceive that, our ability to reason, our ability to cognate, and our ability to then assimilate knowledge through communication with each other through means of language. Because we should note that in Genesis, the very first thing that God said to Adam was to name the creatures of the world, to speak, to use language. And it was that moment when I think that you could say, some of the rabbis have said that Adam then had a soul, because that was what differentiated them from all other creatures, that he could identify, he had consciousness. He could know what was going on, as opposed to being like the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom, where you're basically an emotional being that's tied to life. You don't have the ability to engage in reason. And all the things we're talking about here, the development of the computer, the development of computer code, the development of society, these things emanate from our ability to reason.
Indeed. And the question of 0 to 1, if you will, how do you get from nothing to something or from nothing to everything, is a profound question that cosmology now speaks to in a profound way. And the Big Bang theory is not a theory that provides a causal explanation for the origin of the universe. Rather, it describes the first event, the first effect, and leaves necessarily the first cause as an unanswered question, because what comes into existence at the beginning of the universe is matter, space, time, and energy. This is an implication of the application of general relativity to understanding the origin of the universe, that space and time are connected. And Stephen Hawking realized in the 1960s when he was doing his PhD thesis, if the universe is expanding outward in the forward direction of time, roughly like a balloon, then as you wind the clock backwards, the matter of the universe is getting more and more densely compacted. And according to general relativity, massive bodies curve space. So the very fabric of space or space-time. So as that matter gets more and more densely compacted in the reverse direction of time, ultimately going back to a point of maximum compression, you eventually get a point of maximum curvature as well. Mm-hmm. And in fact, an infinitely tight curvature at some limiting point in the past which you cannot reason physically. In fact, infinite curvature corresponds to zero spatial volume. And this represents, as Paul Davies said, an extremity past which the physicists can no longer devise explanations. And you certainly can't provide a materialistic explanation for the origin of matter, space, time, and energy, because before there was matter, there was no matter to do the causing. And so this is the kind of conundrum that scientists are confronted with the Big Bang theory, whether in its initial form or the more current inflationary cosmology. In both cases, there's a definite beginning. Now, there have been attempts to get around that with a model of cosmological thinking called quantum cosmology. And this is based on the idea that general relativity, Einstein's concept of gravity, might not apply in the very first instances of creation inside a very small smidgen of time called Planck time, and that instead quantum effects would dominate during that time. And so we would need some sort of quantum concept of gravity. But interestingly, when people have developed these quantum cosmological models, and some have claimed, for example, Lawrence Krauss in his book, Universe from Nothing, that they've then been able to use quantum concepts to account for the universe from nothing. But what they really end up meaning, and this is evident when you look at the technical papers, is that what's coming out of the universe of matter, space, time, and energy comes out of a mathematical reality that's known as the universal wave function. It's kind of an analogy to things that are going on in quote unquote ordinary quantum mechanics. But that's a very strange result. You've got matter coming out of math. And one of the leading quantum cosmologists, the Russian physicist Alexander Vilenkin, has commented on this paradox and said, well, before there was matter, space, and time and energy, what were these quantum laws written? What tablet were these written on? The laws of nature typically describe how matter interacts with other matter within the universe. They don't tell us where matter and energy in the universe came from. Mm-hmm. And moreover, he goes on to reflect that mathematics, which is what, the laws would be pure mathematical if there's no matter yet. Mathematics exists in the realm of a mind.
Yeah.
And so he says, are we really saying that a mind predates the universe? And so even these quantum cosmological attempts to get around the definite beginning point that you get to extrapolating using general relativity have their own theistic implications. And I developed some others. I mean, one of the other things which I mentioned earlier is that the mathematical apparatus that's used to model the origin of the universe on these quantum cosmological approaches requires constraints on degrees of mathematical freedom by the specification of what are called boundary constraints. And that just is nothing more than an input of information from the mathematicians and physicists who are modeling the origin of the universe. So they're actually modeling the need for information to get from a mind to get a universe like ours. In the beginning was indeed the word.
Right. And of course, they can't explain how it is that they originated these very abstract concepts like mathematics, which is an abstract way of looking at entities and essences, but also even the idea of space and time is proof that there's a greater supernatural power, because those are abstract concepts that we can prove exist, even though we can't see them, even though they're not material.
And if I can interject just to amplify a point you made earlier, it strikes materialists as inherently implausible to think that a mind created matter. But when they model the origin of the universe now using quantum cosmology, they are essentially modeling the same thing, or inadvertently modeling the same thing, because they are arguing that matter and energy, space and time, are explained by pre-existing laws of physics that have only a mathematical structure, which is to say they're conceptual and mental. And moreover, to use those mathematical constructs to explain our universe, they have to constrain degrees of mathematical freedom inputting information into their mathematical apparatus so that they model a universe that's like ours and not like all the other possible universes. So essentially what's being modeled is precisely a mind acting prior to the origin of matter, space, time, and energy. They are now the ones who are saying that matter is coming out of the mental realm of math, which I think ought to render the concept which previously many materialists found implausible, plausible.
Yeah, I mean, even the idea of to think, the Descartes concept, cogito ergo sum, to think, I think, therefore I am. You have to be able to be in existence in order to think, and thinking didn't just happen out of nothing. There is something that is beyond functional material explanation, and it's something that, again, I mean, it's what Jefferson said is self-evident. But we're talking about also.
Hey, can I go back to Jefferson for just one point? You mentioned him 3 times, and I had an op-ed in the Boston Globe several years ago, which we rerun now every year on 4th of July. It was a 4th of July op-ed, but it was pointing out that Jefferson, who obviously was an important founder, perhaps the least traditionally religious of man of among the founders, but still a theist. Clearly not a deist, by the way, but I could defend that by some of his quotations. He was a non-religious theist, but he believed that the reality of God was knowable by reason because of the design of the world. And he has very specific design arguments that he made that allowed him to refer to nature and nature's God that could be known by reason. Right. And so so it's just an interesting figure in our history because he grounds human rights in human dignity, and human dignity is a product of our having been made by a creator who intended us, and that's the foundation of our whole system. Our whole concept of rights derives from dignity. Dignity comes from the fact of our creation by a divine being whose existence, Jefferson argued, could be known by reason.
Right, and that's completely consistent with religious thought going all the way back into the Talmudic times, and of course to Sinai, and that this idea that in a sense reality itself, but certainly morality, existence, rights, as Jefferson called them, come from the Creator. That's the unique philosophy of America.
That's the Western tradition. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the role of reason in that is affirmed even in Revelation. The Hebrew Bible says the heavens declare the glory of God. That there's something about the evidence that should lead us to the conclusion that God is a reality.
And yet you wrote an incredible book about Darwin and how his book, Origin of Species, was like a thunderclap across the kind of the elite establishment, if you will, in 1859. And it was promoted by T.X. Huxley in England, who then went on to debate ministers and very mockingly, in a mocking style, to denigrate religion. And his grandson, Julian Huxley, who was the founder of UNESCO, was the synthesizer of the eugenic idea, which is entirely Darwinian. The idea that different species might be more evolved than others is the only scientific conclusion you can get from his concept, and did so by also creating what he called in the handbook of UNESCO a world religion, which would be evolutionary humanism, that would replace religious belief and religious thought and faith of all the world religions with an evolutionary idea, while leaving in place the trappings of the religion, the ceremony and the visuals. And I think that describes where we are today. Darwin
and selectively borrowing from the morality of the Judeo-Christian heritage without any grounding for believing that those moral propositions are normative or objective in any sense. Right. After all, if moral ideas or moral intuitions or principles are simply things that are programmed into us by a long process of undirected evolutionary refinement, once we realize that, they were put in place by evolution for the survival of the group or of the species. And I realized that obeying one or the other of them may contradict my own personal survival interests. I have no real reason to obey them or to respect them. And so the problem with evolutionary accounts of ethics are that they don't stand their own exposure. Once you realize that all a moral that the only thing a moral proposition is a reflection of the programming of the human race by evolution to advance the survival of the human race in general. There are many occasions where my interests and the interests of the human race might other people might diverge, and anyone who comes to that conclusion will become, will say, well, why bother? It's
Right.
it's not an adequate grounding for those moral principles that have made the West flourish.
It also negates what they claim is the cornerstone of their faith, which is reason. In other words, it says there's no reason. Everything is just all about survival, which is an animal idea.
Well, this is a huge point, and one that deeply troubled Darwin. He realized that if our minds are the product of the same process of evolution that produced the insects or the great apes, how can we trust the reliability of the mind, especially when we're reasoning about things like the origin of species that are far removed from anything to do with our survival needs?
Right. I mean, it gets into the idea that there is ultimately that even reality itself is not knowable.
Yeah.
And that, this gets into the Immanuel Kant's idea of the nominal universe versus the phenomenal universe, which he said is the real universe that we can't know, but the nominal universe is the universe we do know, and that's not real. It kind of created like this vice. But bringing things to today, Stephen, you talk about the scientific community beginning to once again rethink, this idea that there is this separation between faith and science. And when we're talking faith, we're not talking particularly denominational religion. That's a personal question. We're talking about the belief in a creator of the universe, a giver of the law, which is something that is the underpinning of Western civilization and probably all civilization. Is this something that, your books probably played a major role in it, but is this something that's happening, do you think, in science today?
Well, the main argument of the book is that the God hypothesis provides the best explanation of these three big discoveries about biological, physical, and cosmological origins. The universe had a beginning, as best we can tell from our own physics and cosmology. Mm-hmm. The universe has been finely tuned from the beginning to allow for the possibility of life, which nearly all physicists accept, however they attempt to explain it. And thirdly, that at the foundations of life, the molecules of life reveal digital information, and that the origin of life depends on the origin of such information. These are huge discoveries. We didn't know these things even 100 years ago. And I argue that intelligent design, and indeed a theistic designer, best explains this ensemble of evidence. And therefore, that the God hypothesis should be returning. Now, I also have independent indicators that it is returning. One is just the extraordinary response I've gotten to the book from a number of very high-powered scientists around the world who have endorsed it. Science professors at mainstream research universities who hold endowed or titled chairs, a Nobel laureate in physics from Cambridge University. So those are little anecdotally, there's much more sympathy to this idea than anyone would have thought. But also, there's an important sociologist of religion at Rice who's picking up some of the same thing, that once you get past the ardent and zealous statements of scientific atheism from science popularizers like Bill Nye the Science Guy, or Richard Dawkins, or Lawrence Krauss, there's far more sympathy there's far more skepticism about a strictly materialistic worldview, and far more openness to belief in a God, again, without maybe a lot of denominational specificity, but there's a growth of religious belief among the scientific community that some sociologists and pollsters are picking up. While at the same time, in the popular culture, it's really going the other direction. Young people have really imbibed this new atheist message, and pollsters are picking up what they call, or detecting a phenomenon they call the rise of the nuns, the religiously unaffiliated agnostics and atheists among young people. And when you probe that group, you find that that science, or the perception of what science is claiming, has played an outsized role in the disaffection of those young people with traditional religious belief. 76% of young agnostics and atheists say that the findings of science make belief in God less likely. I think it's exactly the opposite. That's the case I make in the new book.
And do so quite well. Anyways, Stephen, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. Great conversation. I really appreciate it.
You too, Charles. Thank you. From Boston to Seattle, we traversed the country by just transmitting some information. It was,
you bet.
Yeah.
Stephen
Okay.
Meyer is the author of Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 scientific discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe, available at Amazon.com.